It is quite fitting that today is Mother's Day and we get to welcome the brilliant Rumaan Alam, who will be in conversation with the equally brilliant Melissa Scholes Young. So Melissa Scholes Young recently published her debut novel, Flood, which, according to her website, is the novel Mark Twain would have written if Becky Thatcher had gone home for her high school reunion and found Tom Sawyer. It takes place in Mark Twain's boyhood home in Hannibal, Missouri, and follows the story of Laura Brooks, who fled her trailer home at 18 for life as a nurse in Florida. Rumaan Alam has an innate and remarkable power to investigate the themes of class, gender, race, and family in his writing. In addition to his newly published That Kind of Mother, Rumaan is also the author of Rich and Pretty. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, New York Magazine, the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. That Kind of Mother recently received a glowing review from Lisa Page, who wrote for the Washington Post, who is here in the audience with us today. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from that review because I think it really sums up Rumaan's book and why we're all so excited to hear him speak today. So, Alam, who is the adoptive father of 2 Black boys, has created an outstanding depiction of motherhood and cross-racial adoption. He deftly sets up these characters to fail repeatedly, even as they persevere. The tensions of privilege and identity are brilliantly set against the backdrop of wealthy American cities, and Alam's pacing is phenomenal. That Kind of Mother is an astonishing book, one unafraid to look at the minefield of parenting and race, and it reveals how we blind ourselves to the truth and how we might finally open our eyes. So with that, I welcome both Rumaan and Melissa to the stage. Please give them a warm welcome.
I don't know why Elizabeth had to read that review, because I'm going to get it tattooed on my arm. Just for future reference, it'll make it much, every event I do will be much simpler. I'll just show people that quote from Lisa's review. The technically gifted writers.
We know how to do this. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's Mother's Day.
Yeah, it is. Happy Mother's Day to everyone in the world. Everyone is somebody's child, so even if you're not a mother, you know.
So it's Mother's Day, and Rebecca, your protagonist, is a poet.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're going to actually start with a poem for Mother's Day. It's a little gift to all of you.
This is not a poem from my book. I should point out there's no poetry in my book, even though
she's a poet.
She's a poet.
Why is there no poetry?
Can
you?
Okay.
You can hear okay?
I can't hear myself. There's no poetry in my book because I can't write poetry, and that's why. Yeah.
Right. So this is by Maggie Smith, who she's a friend of mine. You probably know her work also, called The Mother. So let's start with a poem.
All right, I'm going to read a poem. Ooh, nothing is more serious than reading a poem in a bookstore. The Mother by Maggie Smith. The mother is a weapon you load yourself into, little bullet. The mother is glass through which you see in excruciating detail yourself. The mother is landscape. See how she thinks of a tree and fills a forest with the repeated thought. Before the invention of cursive, the mother is manuscript. The mother is sky. See how she wears a shawl of starlings, how she pulls the thrumming around her shoulders. The mother is a prism. The mother is a gun. See how light passes through her. See how she fires. Oh, that's good. I know, right? That's a good poem. I didn't write it, so I can say that.
Again, it's Maggie Smith. Yeah, we didn't write that. My first question is whether or not Rebecca would have written that poem.
It's
a little rhetorical literary analysis to begin with.
Well, so not only does my book not contain any poetry, I think there's one sentence from a poem in the book that we are meant to believe is Rebecca's work, but not only is there so little of her poetry in the book, I actually don't know what her poetry would sound like. So I don't know. I mean, she's a poet because I wanted her to be an artist, and I wanted it to be an art that seemed very serious. And I feel like people who write novels take poets very seriously, don't you think?
Yes. We think they don't quite touch the ground.
Yeah, I feel like poets are sort of oracular, and actually I think it says this in the book, at the end of the book in particular, which I won't spoil because my sister told me not to spoil it because she's still reading it, that there's something we expect our poets to deliver, something that we don't expect from other artists.
I expect them to have all the answers.
Yeah.
Which is, and I expect fiction writers just to discomfort.
Right.
Like my job is just to poke at things, and your job is to figure them out.
Right.
Yeah,
I
as a
think
reader.
That's true.
I'm going to quote from Lisa's amazing review. If you had it tattooed, Rumaan, I would just ask you to pull your arm out, because I think this is a part you would include. Lisa begins her review with, when you become a mother, you start to disappear. Your body becomes someone else's. Your priorities change. Your existence is suddenly tied to breastfeeding, dirty laundry, the changing table. Even you can't see yourself. So would you start by talking a bit about Rebecca's disappearing and how she does or does not embrace or resist like this identity of motherhood? Because that seems to be the first part of the book.
That is the first part of the book, and I had not conceived of it as Lisa diagnoses it as disappearance. So it's interesting to hear. I mean, it's like I'm an egomaniac, so it's interesting to me to hear how other people talk about the work that I did, because I was so inside of it that I don't know what I was trying to accomplish. But
and you don't know what your readers will do with it.
And you don't. No, you don't. But I didn't see it as a matter of disappearance, but I think it's an interesting reading. But I have 2 small children, and it is a reckoning with your own insignificance, I think. You have to kind of prostrate yourself before them and let them. There's this amazing, this is such a tangent, but years ago there was a profile of the actress Frances McDormand in The New Yorker, which is an amazing profile. She's an amazing person. And one of the quotes is, like, after she became a mother, she said, like, here I am, this feminist, letting a little boy throw up into my hands. And I feel like that is a real, that is real, you know?
Yeah, but I would resist a little the urge to define feminism as also not nurturing, right? Someone vomiting in my hands, or my
Somebody
purse,
get Frances
they've done it
McDormand
everywhere.
on the phone right now. I'm so mad at her. No, but I mean, yes, I mean, I totally agree. I just think it is a stark, there's something very, that is a very particular image. And definitely my kids have thrown up in my hands.
Oh yeah, in my purse, my bags, my shoes, everywhere.
Down my back.
On Mother's Day.
Yes.
In fact, I canceled Mother's Day a few years ago because of vomit. I feel that that's a way in which you have to cancel Mother's Day.
That's a legitimate reason.
Do over. Do over. You have ruined it. So speaking of, I'm going to have you read a section that will not give anything away, I promise, okay? But
I mean, to be fair, I don't really believe in spoiler alerts, so I feel like this conversation may touch on what actually happens in this book, and my sister will be angry, but...
She won't. She won't. And in fact,
if she were a good sister, she would have finished my book already, so...
This fact...
it's whatever, you know.
Did she get an ARC of it?
No.
Okay, well, in her defense...
And she is a doctor, so she's a busy woman.
Okay, in her defense, Rumaan, I got the book 6 months ago, so in her defense, and stayed up all night reading it. All night. Thank you. I was at at the Tucson Literary Festival, and I was the one going around live tweeting, everyone needs to read this book, when I was supposed to be talking about my book and all the work because we were talking specifically about men writing women's point of views. And why we ask women these questions, but we don't ask men the same questions. Yeah. So talk a little bit about why you keep writing women so well, and why I was raging about this book to everyone.
I don't know about so well, but if the question is why at all, I think the writing is informed by the reading. And the reading that I've done, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, our best artists right now, our best writers are women, right? I think that this is like a form that women now are in control of.
I feel like there should be some applause for that.
I mean, I feel like it's...
There was a moment of hesitation and you all missed it. Just, sorry.
But I feel like it's self-evident, and I also feel like it's the first time culturally that's been able to be true, right? Because historically, that was not an option for women who are still alive. You know, I mean, Alice Munro is a weird outlier, but a woman of her generation, you wouldn't expect them to make a career out of writing, especially out of writing about being a woman, which she often did. Where was I going? Oh, anyway, I've read a lot of books by women. A lot of the books that are most important to me are by women, and I think you digest inevitably, and then, I don't believe in write what you know, which is what people always say, but you write what you've read, and I think the reading is what affects my predisposition towards a certain subject.
And so Rich and Pretty, women point of views.
Yeah.
That Kind of Mother, women point of views. We were just talking about the third book, Women.
It's actually not. Okay. Yeah.
You don't have to tell us, yeah.
Yeah, it's too soon to talk about, but I mean, maybe it will be by the time I finish it. Who knows? Yeah.
So the piece, the part that I'd like you to read, and this is, your sister will forgive us because this is Christine, Rebecca's sister, in conversation with her. And it reminded me a bit of what Lisa said about the disappearing and the identity. It also talks about the look of motherhood, the look of motherhood. I don't think there's any spoilers.
Well, before I read this, okay. I will just explain briefly what the book is about. This book is about a woman named Rebecca who is a poet who lives in suburban Washington, D.C., not far from where we are sitting right now. And she is married to a man who is an English diplomat who works at the British Embassy and then later goes to work in the private sector. And she becomes a parent and she forges a relationship with her nanny. And then her nanny, this is the spoiler part, but it's on the jacket of the book, so you'll see it.
Go back. Before she was the nanny.
Before she is the nanny, she's a lactation consultant in the hospital, so they bond in the hospital, and then the nanny dies unexpectedly in childbirth, and Rebecca, her employer, adopts the resulting baby. The nanny is black and Rebecca is white, so that is sort of one of the tensions at the heart of the book. But now I will read the part that Melissa is asking me to read. Forcing me to read. This takes place on Halloween, right? Okay. The world did not matter. There were 2 children and several pieces of candy. There were yells and spills and a general sense of mayhem. Even the babies seemed manic. Rebecca showed her sister the trick that television was an opiate, and they left the elder cousins in charge. Tim cleared the dishes, and Christine spread a blanket on the dining room floor and let the baby flail about on his tummy, while Andrew sat unsteady sentry, surrounded by plastic toys, the 2 companionable in their immobility. "How are you doing?" Christine herself sprawled on her stomach with the 2 infants. Her sister's edge of panic made Rebecca more resolute. "I'm fine." She said it like she didn't understand the question. Christine exhaled like she was psyching herself up. "Rebecca, did you ever think that you might possibly be depressed?" Rebecca laughed. "Overwhelmed, maybe. Tired, sure. But depressed? Like, you mean clinical?" "Postpartum." "I thought it went without saying, Chris. Andrew's mine, but he's not mine." "You don't have to have given birth." Christine seemed to understand that she was the family's Cassandra. To correct for this, she aimed for even greater dramatic flourish. It was an odd tactic. She pushed her fingers into her unruly red hair. "I'm just asking. I worry." "I'm not depressed." Rebecca felt defensive. This is what I'm like." "It's been almost a year, Rebecca. You just don't seem like you. This is who I am now." Being with her sister made Rebecca more dramatic by osmosis. But perhaps it was true that this was who she was now. "You're a stay-at-home mother? Since when?" "Since Priscilla died." "It's more than that. You seem depleted as well as enriched. And I don't mean tired. I know what tired looks like. Look at me." Rebecca looked. Her sister did look paler than was normal, except for the skin around her eyes, tinted with sleeplessness. This was the look of motherhood, but was offset or compensated for by something else, a faint glow, a vague contentment.
You can clap.
Oh, thank you. Maggie. You don't have to clap.
You can clap.
Oh, I feel like Jeb Bush now. Please clap.
I'm hoping that's the first time you felt like Jeb Bush.
Maybe the only time, yeah.
We should talk a bit about sisters, too.
Oh, yeah. A lot of the book is about this particular connection between women, between a woman and the woman who cares for her children, which is it is not a familial relationship. It is an employer-employee relationship. But I think that the reason that Rebecca establishes this relationship with her nanny is that that is how people are taught to parent, right? In the larger cycle of life, you are taught, it's like being taught about menstruation. Like, you're taught by a big sister or your friend's big sister, or, there's this intelligence that is handed down, but not written down. I mean, there are plenty of books about what it's like to give birth or what to expect, but I feel like my friends who have done this have really got the dirt from their other friends or their friends' mothers, or the idea that that there's this body of knowledge that is yours in this sort of communal, almost villagey way.
And Rebecca goes to the baby books and finds them wholly disappointing.
Which they are. I mean, oof.
They're terrifying.
My husband is a very good student. So when we had our first son, he read like all the books, and then when we were sleep training, he read all the books, and I tried to read that sleep training book, and I was like, this jerk. Like, those books are, they are full of facts, but not, like, what you need is not facts. What you need is the advice from someone who you trust.
And experience.
Which
you can't get.
Yeah.
Except to hire the lactation consultant and bring her home with
her. Right.
And she really does. She looks at Priscilla as a nurturing figure who knows more than she does.
Right. I mean, we should all be so lucky to have that person.
And to have the privilege to be able to hire that person.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if I didn't have, we have had 3 different childcare providers in my household, all like astonishing people who keep our life on track. I never could have written this book without childcare,
And yet it's a luxury often. And yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Priscilla really is the family Rebecca chooses. And so much of this book is about the idea of who we're related to versus who we choose.
Yeah.
And the way that having both children really disrupts Rebecca's relationships with her own family. And in some ways, she feels closer to Priscilla's own daughter.
I think that's true. Rebecca's sisters are not wild about her adopting a black child. And the way that comes out, anyone in this room with any kind of relationship to adoption will understand how that comes out. I think those conversations tend to play out in the same way. I'm concerned about you, or I'm worried that you haven't thought through X, Y, and Z. And I think Rebecca really, I hope in the book, I hope you see on the page that her sisters do not support fundamentally what it is she's trying to do, and that forever kind of severs her from how they relate in the book.
How much of it do you think is that, Christine, that they just misunderstand? And I was thinking about some things you said earlier this week when you were on the Kojo Nandi show about what people misunderstand. What do people and the sisters misunderstand, and even Rebecca herself misunderstand about biracial adoption that we get, once you read it, we get to learn about it through Rebecca learning about it.
Right.
But what is it that people misunderstand so much?
Yeah, that's such a big question. Basically everything. This book...
You have to read the whole book.
I think that adoption is not well understood in the culture, and I think the degree to which it is understood, it is informed by a television miniseries understanding of what takes place, which is really not... there's no monolithic experience of anything, so there's no monolithic experience of adoption, but certainly what I'm writing about in this book is a very highly exaggerated thing. It's within the realm of possibility that somebody would die and that you would choose to adopt their child, but this is not how families are actually being made. It is simply using this act of making a family to push on all of the language around that act. And yes, I think that adoption is not well understood, and I think that maybe her sisters are sort of weirdly dispassionate about it, and they talk about it like a logical choice. And I'm not sure that logic has a ton to do once emotion comes into the room, So logic, like evaluating something through that lens, evaluating your own family. It just doesn't work. Yeah.
And it I can see that it adds an extra layer of stress to the marriage as well.
Yeah, it's not a great marriage anyway. Oh, that's the part my sister was most worried about. She said, don't tell me what's going to happen in this marriage. So, sorry, Lila. But yes, I do think it is a particular... and I see this happen. I think this happens where you have a kid and you reprioritize everything. Your career, your marriage. I mean, ideally, it's a process of reprioritization that is, you're in it together. But I'm not sure that's always the case.
Well, and it seems that motherhood makes Rebecca actually more of who she is as an artist. And I think that has more to do with the marriage than anything else.
Oh, that's interesting.
Him not quite understanding what it means to be an artist, what it means for her to write poetry, and what she does in that room all day that she needs a nanny for.
What does she do all day, Melissa? I really don't know the answer to that question. She thinks.
She naps.
Yeah. And we should all have that. We should all be so lucky to have that liberty.
To create, I think, good art and to be able to create it as well as you possibly can. I mean, you have to be rested. You have to be fed. You have to be... It's difficult under any condition to make art.
And it's work I value, which is why I wanted to sort of animate that particular conflict. She could, I chose all of the, you choose the building blocks of a novel very carefully, right? You think about every little choice, and I thought a lot about why I wanted her to be a poet. I wanted this to be sort of this labor that is of negligible. There's no capital value around poetry unless you are, that Instagram poet who's on the bestseller list. There's no money in poetry. So her work is divorced from an understanding of value.
And yet, when you and I met last year, you talked about taking care of the boys and then locking yourself in the basement, working on the book, and really tandem parenting in order to make art. And it doesn't seem, because Rebecca doesn't quite have that same relationship, to compartmentalize it. I love that you made her a poet, actually. There's so many books that we authors complain about where writers just write about what it is like to be a writer. And this is a fresh perspective on success and failure.
I mean, the way she works has there's no relationship between the way I work and the way she works. And she is tremendously successful in the context of this book in a way that I am not.
Like that too.
Which is also sort of like weird fantasy fulfillment.
Right, yes. I felt that too, reading it. I was like, yes, thank goodness, Rebecca. Because it can go so many different ways.
But she is, the book takes place between 1985 and 1999, and that was not that long ago. But I do think fathers, at least the fathers of my generation and younger than my generation, have a very different way of thinking about household labor. I think that's something that has genuinely changed in our lifetimes. And Christopher, who is her husband, is older than she is, and really comes from a different way of thinking about the labor that is the responsibility of a woman and the labor that is the responsibility of a man. And in a moment when so much in the culture seems to have gotten worse, I do think that is something that has actually gotten better. And I'm often baffled, I am baffled when I see my friends who are straight couples, and the dad is like, oh, well, Wendy will cook dinner. I'm like, what is your problem, dude? You better make dinner, I think that those expectations have shifted a lot.
They have, but it still seems to be class-based. And I think of when Rebecca's husband's mother comes over.
Yes.
And that's revealed to not just be a male problem at all.
Right.
In the way that she treats Priscilla.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. I mean, using the... this is the thing, right? A book is sort of about what it's about, but you use what it's about to get at all this other stuff. And so it is about this act of adoption, but the fact that you have this domestic worker in the house and she is black and the family is white lets you get at all of these other things about race and about class and about what is woman's work? What is woman's work? And why is that a phrase that even we can use in a room like this and people know what I'm talking about? Where these ideas came from and what they mean as the culture progresses,
Are we progressing?
Well, that's a...
You're in Washington.
Yeah, that's another question altogether.
I'm always interested in revision. And what...
No, I'm not. I hate revising.
No, because I hate
interested
it.
in.
Because I hate it. Those first drafts are so fun. You get to discover things as you go. You get to become intentional in the work. But it's revision where everyone else starts entering your head, where the editor starts. And I'm wondering what you cut.
Oh my goodness.
What do you miss?
So much. To the point that I actually can't remember what is in the finished text. I did a lot of versions of this book. When I first turned in the book, my agent said to me, she said the page 120 should be page 1. And she was right. And so I borrowed her house in East Hampton, which is amazing. And I went there for 6 days, and I started on page 120, and I wrote 110 new pages that in 5 or 6 days. It was awful. That's what I mean when I say revision is awful. But it's true that I feel like you can't actually begin until you've finished, and then it's just a matter of chiseling away at the thing. But so much has changed in... I think I did 12 drafts of this book, like 12 full drafts. Yeah, I have a huge. If anyone is here from the Mishner Center, I have a huge box of drafts under my desk. I would love somebody to pay me $1 million for them. So, anyone, whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready.
We should. They probably have questions too.
Yeah, ask questions.
They have questions. Or we could just talk all day.
Sonia has a
Sonia.
question.
Oh.
Coach the microphone. Follow the rules.
You're being recorded, Sonia. That's why.
Rumaan.
Yes.
I loved your book.
She works smart. Yeah.
So in Lisa Page's review, she talks about the disappearance of Rebecca, but will you talk a little bit more about your choice to have Priscilla die in childbirth and how she disappears? Yeah. And also, can you talk a little bit about her daughter as well?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. What a great question. It is a very tricky thing to set out to write a book that addresses Blackness and to ground that book in the choice to kill the Black person, because there's a tremendous body of literature in this country that relies on the brokenness of the Black body, and it is such a trope that it's almost inescapable, but then reifying that trope is a very particular choice that I was very conscious of, and I wanted to, but it's important for the dynamic at play in the book for the mother, Priscilla, to simply vanish and to take volition out of the act of adoption. The only way I could make that happen was for her to die. It happens to have a kind of resonance with what we understand now about Black maternity mortality rates, so there's a lot of real information in this, but it's still a very particular choice, and it's a very tricky thing when writing, because I am not Black myself, so writing so close to trope is a very scary thing. So the way that I countered that was to have her adult daughter survive in the book and serve as kind of the presence of a Black point of view that is consistently pushing back against Rebecca's point of view, which is pretty white. But there's a lot of stuff in the book that...
Well, and the father is unknown as well.
The father is unknown. Priscilla is a nanny. Her daughter is a nurse. I'm using a lot of the sort of... I mean, if you've watched television in the last 40 years, this is what the narrative of Blackness is in the popular culture. And it is not an accurate representation. Black women do not exist in this country to take care of everyone else. And so but I'm very conscious of choosing to do that with these women and hopefully to undo it a little bit. And I think you have to, I hope, I mean, it's not for me to say, but I hope by the end of the book, you see how facile that understanding of Blackness is and how I hope the book undoes it a little bit.
Well, and I think that's why we needed Rebecca as the narrator, because as
I think so too.
As she goes through that experience, the reader, you can access it in a way. It reminds me of that passage in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, where he explains that people misunderstand why particularly slaves sing. They think they're because they're happy, and then he says, I misunderstood too. And then he logically leads you through how he misunderstood this thing that he should have understood. Rebecca does that. She says, I misunderstood, especially when she thinks Priscilla is part of her family. And then she realizes how little she actually knows about Priscilla's family, that there's a disconnect.
She knows basically nothing about her. And some of that comes from how much does anyone know about their employees? But some of that comes from race and the expectations that we have around, real openness around people of a different race. And it's true, though, that you are really inside of the perspective of the white person in this book. And it's I hope that the reader sees what the strategy is behind that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I haven't read the book yet, but I know Melissa and have heard wonderful things about it.
Thank you.
And my question is about, I guess, thinking about the ways that adoption undoes the relationship between biology and motherhood, and thinking and imagining that in your household, motherhood is sort of freed up a little bit from gender.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if your experience of mothering and having motherhood freed from gender informs your understanding of motherhood freed from biology.
That's a great question. In some ways it does, and in other ways it doesn't, because our concept around these things comes from the cultural imagination. And in the cultural imagination, motherhood is a very particular thing. I mean, I'm sure at the front of this store there's a stack of books about motherhood. And you see it in our children's literature, you see it in the Odyssey. I mean, like, every great text of humankind is really about somebody trying to go home to their mom. And maybe there's a reason for that, and maybe that is to do with biology as much as the culture. But it's true that my family does not work that way. But I wouldn't dismiss the significance of the figure. So it's a balance. It's a balance. And in our own household, the kids, like, they make Mother's Day cards at school, and we talk about who performs mothering in their lives, and what does that mean, and you can value, like, other mothers we know, or my sister, who is like they also think my sister is my mother, which is hilarious, and it's a whole other story. They keep asking, they're like, so Lila's your mom, right? They're very young. But
you can see why Lila hasn't finished the book yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Haven't found time. Mm-hmm.
But I think my husband and I both revalue what that figure represents, and in the lives of adoptees, what that represents. There's a lot of emotion tied up in a figure that you can't quite know or access. But isn't that sort of the human condition also? So,
What do you do with the Mother's Day cards?
Oh, so they made Mother's Day cards, and my older son wrote a Mother's Day card to his babysitter, and it was so cute. And it says, I'm glad you love me even though I'm naughty so much. So cute. And I think that we can't make a big deal out of it, because I have to honor the fact that they may perceive having two dads as a lack on their part. And I can't try to persuade them otherwise. All I can do is show them what they have, and to say, like, if you have something in your heart for, like, a maternal figure, well, that's a value. And that maternal figure may be your imagining of your birth mother. It may be your feeling about your babysitter or your teachers or my sister or my mother or your other grandmother. And it's all, you don't run out of love. So it's like, it doesn't matter how you direct it.
I wonder if I keep telling people this is the book about mothering that I needed. This is the one I was waiting to be written.
Thank you.
Especially,
High praise.
Especially because of how she is trying to make art and balance mothering, and how she is split open by this type of creativity that birthing allows.
Yeah.
But it is also a way in which she has to reinvent. I wouldn't even say reinvent. She has to figure out who she was before and who she is now. and that requires a bit of going backwards. But I wonder if we simply expect too much of the role in all of the work in our culture.
I think so, and I think it's obviously silly to suggest that. I mean, this is something because I've seen my friends who are artists reckon with this. Only the women, none of the men. They don't give a shit. Because they can do whatever they want, right? I mean, we live in a culture where men can kind of do whatever they want and sort of be. There's no. The notion of sacrifice is really disconnected from the idea of paternity. But the notion of sacrifice is really built into our cultural ideas around motherhood. And so I've seen a lot of my friends who are mothers, especially who are younger than me, reckoning with that. And I always say, like, I think it's over. I mean, I think we overthink that. To be sure, I'm sure you've sacrificed plenty as an artist in order to be a parent. But I mean, it enriches, but you know what I mean? It's like, it's all a give and take. Like, being a parent enriches your life and it enriches your art. And in fact, I didn't do anything until I had kids, artistically. You will notice I never published a book before I had a child.
I never wrote.
So having children is a very real drain on you emotionally and physically, and it makes you're tired all the time. I'm tired right now, and I slept so much last night. But it also makes you kind of a genius at solving. I mean, you become kind of a genius. You either you deliver a baby out of your body, which is sort of a superhero act, or you become a parent and you stay up all night and a baby's throwing up all over you, and then you get dressed and you go to work the next day, and that's also kind of a superhero act. And so I feel so unfazed by things now. I mean, my kid the other day was doing this thing that was so annoying, and I realized that I can just turn off my ear. I could just choose not to hear him. And he was making this noise that was so, it was like an achievement in human history that he was making this noise that was so annoying. And I was just like, I'm just going to choose not to hear you right now because that is how I'm going to survive this situation. Do you know what Beyblades are? If anyone knows what Beyblades are, it was a noise that involved a Beyblade. It's a horrible, horrible invention.
Or you can say it. I'll repeat it for you because you look comfy. Yeah, you look comfy. Good. Be comfortable. Let me repeat the question.
That is a really good question. I haven't so far. The question is whether my experience as a father by adoption, how that plays out in the sort of in a public way, right? Is that that's a fair, how people respond
and
to that.
And about primary caregiving.
And about the role of the primary caregiver in a household where you have two men. People, to answer part of your question, people have this tremendous desire to, people say to me all the time that my children look like me, which is patently untrue, and a completely preposterous thing to say. But it's also sort of, in a weird way, I think it's a generous impulse. It's a way of saying, I see what's happening here, and, it's cute, and my kids are so handsome that, of course, I'm, flattered that anyone would think I look like them. But they are clearly black people, and I am clearly not a black person. But there's a lot of magical thinking that goes into, in the general population. But also, I don't care. And I think in some ways you have to harden yourself, and I'm sure you've had this experience too, your responsibilities to your children. And so you actually can't really take on the judgments or confusions of the general public. And I get really annoyed when people said this a lot when they were babies, as though they were some sort of curiosity and not a human being. And now when people say anything to me about the kids and their blackness, I just treat them as you would a crazy person, because I don't want my kids to hear that. Because my kids are black, and I totally value a conversation about, they do have beautiful hair, and they do have beautiful skin, but I don't want to constantly, they don't need that approbation from some stranger, and they don't need me to be engaged in a conversation about my relationship to them, because they already know what that relationship is. And so I don't need someone else to ratify that relationship. And as a man, I do think it is a little easier for me, because I think that men who are seen in a caregiving role get a sticker. You get an A for effort. So when people see me, they tend to be good for you, Dad. And I'm well, what do you imagine is going to happen if I'm not here taking care of my children? But again, I think I just shut it out because I don't care, you know.
I get that question on book tour. Where are your children?
Yeah.
As if I can't write a book and there isn't another person in my life that could take care of them. I just look around like,
you're like, oh God, where are they?
No.
I lost them.
How could I keep them alive and make art at the same time? Yeah.
What comments do you get about your children being black, and how do you handle those?
You know, I think all of your black colleagues and friends would tell you that there's a sort of, there's a whole litany of things that you hear, and how do I handle them? I mostly don't hear them. I mostly just tune them out. I respect and value that my children are black. That is like a huge component of who they are as human beings. I don't need to have that conversation with strangers unless those strangers are themselves black. So there's a weird, like, the flip side of that is when a black auntie stops me on the street, which happens all the time, to talk about their hair or their skin, I listen to that. Because that is interesting to me, and that is like my responsibility to listen to that. But
reminds me of when Priscilla's daughter is trying to explain to Rebecca how to care for their skin.
Which I have heard so many variations on that speech. And again, I really appreciate it when it's like someone's grandmother is telling me that. And I heard that a lot when the babies were small. And I heard that as this impulse of like, oh, well, they know, and they want me to know because they want my children to be taken care of. And that is sort of a generous impulse. The flip side of that is like once, oh God, I had tuned this out, but I just remembered that we were in a hotel in Miami, and there were all these Italian tourists there, and one of them like rubbed my older son's head, and I was like infuriated to the craziest degree, in a way that I would not have been had it been a black person, right? Like, it's just that exchange is a very particular kind of exchange, and so I guess I have these responses to them, and for the most part, it's work. I choose not to carry that stuff, you know.
And watching Rebecca go through to get to the understanding you seem to now have is one of the things I think that makes the book so accessible.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just going to keep raving about this book.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
This question is shifting gears a lot. Can you talk about the role of Princess Diana in the book?
Oh,
and
I love that
question. And also sort of like where it came in your, like, was she the first thing you thought of, or how she sort of played a role in your...
Yes. Thank you for that question. There is a lot in this book about Princess Diana, and I don't work from A to Z when I'm working, and I think some writers do, and they have a really strong sense of where the book is going, but I don't, and I feel like it snowballs, and all these little pieces fall into it. But at a certain point early in the book, I realized that I had decided that this woman was married to this tall Englishman, and they were having a baby in 1985, and I was like, hey, Prince Harry was born in 1985. Like, this is amazing. And so then Princess Diana just intruded, and then she really intrudes into the text later on. So there's this weird thing where it's like you're in charge, but you're also not really in charge, and you're sort of listening to where the book is taking you, right?
I don't want to give anything away, but I love when writers are generous to their characters, and there is a gift that you give to Rebecca.
That was a gift to myself, frankly. She's talking about this thing about Princess Diana, which we won't spoil because it's dear. I ended up really, I have like, I had no particular feelings about Princess Diana when I started this book.
Really?
And now I'm super into Princess Diana.
She's your superhero. Yeah, I could really see you talking to her in your life out loud. Yes.
No, I think
let me repeat it.
Yeah,
the question is about adoption and specifically how biracial adoption is encouraged or discouraged. Yes.
Open adoption in this country is mostly. I guess this is what I mean when I say adoption is not well understood. There's maternal volition involved in adoption, so our children were placed with us by the women who are their primary parent, and so So I'm doing the work that I was asked to do by the person who is in charge of that situation. So so I guess maybe this sort of dovetails with what you were asking before, that if my children's biological mothers felt that race was not an impetus to my raising them well, then that is the only judgment that matters to me. So, and that is sort of like the challenge that I will have to meet for the rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That reminds me of the scene when Rebecca is with the headmaster and is being told that her son acts out. That's in the book.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that is very common. Some of this is very gendered. People say things to women about their children that I'm not sure they would say to men. Because again, I'm busy getting like patted on the back for even like being with my kids. And also, you know what my husband says, which is actually like the best answer, but he's kind of intimidating in a way that I'm not. He says, "Why do you need to know?" Which is of course the only real answer, because nobody needs to know like any of this information. But you're not wrong in that you need to model for your children how to sort of answer that in a way that they understand that there's no particular shame, or that, you know, and this is like something that Claudia Rankine has written about so much about race. Like, there are ways in which you have to take this in, and also there are ways in which you have to keep it at an arm's length. And it's a tricky balance, you know.
I think we have time for another question.
Anyone else? Somebody ask a funny question.
Sonia, you have a funny
Sonia,
question?
ask me a funny question. You could just shout it out. I'll say it out loud. Yes. The question, in case you didn't hear, was about the first 10 pages of the book are about giving birth, which, as discussed, used to happen on page 120 of the book. And there's a lot about breastfeeding in the book. Those are two things I cannot possibly know about. But you know, no one knows everything, and if everyone was only writing the book of stuff that they knew, books would be very boring. And I did a lot of research. I interviewed a lot of people. I had casual conversations with people I barely know. People also love to talk about breastfeeding. So if you bring it up to a woman, especially a woman who is in the midst of breastfeeding an infant, she will tell you a lot of information.
What do you want to know?
I mean, it's really true. Like, in fact, I asked this woman once, and she said, "You want to come over and watch me breastfeed?" And I was like, "I kind of do, actually." I watched a lot of videos on the internet of people giving birth and of people learning to breastfeed a child. Two things that are much more complex than, again, you might think if you only had ever watched television, which is all I knew of these things. And for the book to work, I felt that it was really important that I had to inhabit this as deeply as I could. And, you know, I can't possibly know about it, but people don't know about living on Mars either, and they still write books about that. Like, there are ways that you cheat around what is true and what is not true.
There's such an intimacy also. When a lactation consultant solves your problem, you will do anything for them. Send them flowers, send them cars. You will do absolutely anything. There's such a service that's provided that makes her immediate endearment to Priscilla so believable.
Oh, thank you. Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. Oh, so what Sonia is trying to get me to say is that when I was writing this book and I was very confused about the particular choreography of holding a baby and feeding it, I took my shirt off and I held a stuffed animal up to my chest and I used my free hand to do stuff and see if I could actually do stuff while holding a baby. It is actually very difficult. Many women in this room are like, yeah, no, I know that. And of course I was just like miming it. I wasn't actually having like a child like pull on a part of my body. But yes, I try to do my research, Sonia. I try to take it seriously. Thank you.
We can clap for that. Humanity. I don't know where Elizabeth went to, but do you want to keep chatting? You want to sign some books?
Are we done? Do we have to finish? Yeah, all right. We're all out of time.
Do you want to sign some books?
Sure. Yes,
Yay.
thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.